Hello and welcome to the launch of the Unremembered Places by Patrick Baker, which is published today on Thursday, May the 21st. My name is Matt Gaw. I'm the author of Under the Stars, and it is a great pleasure to welcome Patrick here today, who's going to be talking to us about the writing of the book and the inspiration behind it. So first and foremost, welcome Patrick, and congratulations on what is a really beautiful book.
It's very kind of you. Thank you very much, Matt, and hello to you.
So obviously it's an odd situation. We'd all like to be kind of having a glass of wine in a bookshop right now, but it's really nice to be able to talk to you about the book because it really is a fascinating read. I just wondered if you could just kind of give a bit of a background really about what the book is about.
It's about remembering something we've collectively forgotten. So it's a series of journeys made on foot and by paddle roughly over the course of 3 or 4 years. And it's looking for some of the most intriguing but overlooked histories that inhabit some of the more remote locations in Scotland. So yeah, it's the idea kind of came about really through just the time that I've spent in the outdoors over the years. I tend to spend a lot of time in the outdoors, whether it's kind of mountaineering, climbing, canoeing, kayaking. That's a real sort of passion for me. But I suppose over that time, that interest in being in the outdoors has kind of morphed into more of a kind of geekish interest to find really interesting features in the landscape. We're all kind of oddities, whether it's geological, natural, human histories. And I suppose over the years I've kind of spent more and more time diverting off to kind of find these strange features in the landscape.
Brilliant. I was going to say, well, this is obviously, what I should mention as well, is it's not your first book. You've written a really lovely book called The Cairngorms, A Secret History. So obviously you're building up a real familiarity with this landscape. And it's that special thing when you get really familiar with something, it becomes fantastically familiar, but also it becomes quite alien. You notice all these different things about it, and I think that's one of the joys of this book is the fact that you kind of draw out some of the strangeness of the landscapes as well. One of the key threads to this is that this isn't just nature writing. This is very much kind of drawing out the social and the cultural histories as well. Could you talk to us a bit about kind of why you think that's so important for these unremembered places?
Yeah, you're right, Matt. And that was kind of a big theme that I did want to pull out in the book, was that the fact that a lot of these histories and the way we're conditioned to thinking about history is very much in a sort of urbanized context, I guess, and we're quite conditioned to having history delivered to us in that way. And certainly in a Scottish perspective, that almost kind of needs a sense of sort of realignment and recalibrating, really, because our contemporary view of wild places is actually massively different in a collective sense to how they once were used up until sort of relatively recently. I guess we kind of think of Scotland's wild places as being very remote and empty and desolate places, but actually, this is quite a modern construct past the 18th and 19th century in terms of the sort of rural to urban migrations that took place, and obviously the horror of the clearances as well. So when we're thinking about remote places now, we do sort of tend to sort of characterize them with remoteness and desolation, but actually, there's evidence within the landscape of how it used to be in terms of a very sort of, in places, a very teeming, vibrant landscape, full of importance, significance, and cultural identity, and obviously a lot of that has been lost as the landscape has become depopulated. So I guess part of what I wanted to draw out with the book was just getting us to think again about how we perceive wild places and the notion of what really is wild and what our kind of human impression on that landscape has been.
Because you actually use wild in quite an interesting way. Usually, I suppose, kind of traditionally, when wild, the word wild is used in writing, and it's a word that I think many of you use quite a lot. It's it can almost be put in place of wilderness, and it kind of is almost used to separate kind of the human from the non-human world. But you use wild in a very different sense to that, don't you? You kind of use it it has a few roles to play in your book.
Yeah, I think so, and and like I say, I think that's very deliberate, and I'm glad that's kind of come across, actually, certainly in terms of when I travel out to what I would consider to be wild and remote places in Scotland. It's amazing how profuse the sort of human imprint is in certain places. So for me, it kind of almost feels wrong to think of natural history or nature and wild places, certainly in Scotland, as being detached or decoupled from the human influence, and that's what really fascinates me. And I suppose it becomes even more intriguing when those remnants and relics become even harder to find, and they're kind of layered in mystery and not recorded in a formal way as well. And the book was about that. It was about thinking about history that's overlooked, or stories and narratives that are overlooked, rather than history per se. It's that sort of human element to being in a wild place, and the people that have been there before us and kind of used the landscape and lived in that environment. And it's so different to our sort of modern perceptions and our sort of predominantly urbanized view on things, I guess, now. And I suppose that's the same for when I read Under the Stars, Matt. You seem to be keen to sort of pull out or pull away from the sort of contemporary view of things. Certainly, your book talks about darkness and our view of darkness and urban light and getting away from urban light and actually realizing this is a very modern perception that we have, and that shapes how we perceive darkness and wild place. And I think that's where I was kind of saw a similarity between this book and your book, is that actually we just need to sort of step beyond those sort of modern perceptions that we have, certainly from a sort of very, very urbanized perception, I guess.
No, that's a really good point, actually. In terms of the when you were talking there about the unremembered places, you allude to Deakin calling them unwritten places, and you're saying that a lot of the time they have this, the history of them themselves is unrecorded. So I just wondered, you've got such a huge array of different places that you went to. How did you find out about these places? Is it word of mouth or?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, actually, because that kind of formed part of the criteria of what went in the book, actually, and similar to our last book about the Cairngorms, I didn't want to write about the obvious elements of history that have already been documented and that were more sort of in quotes well known. I'm sort of more interested in the peripheral intrigue around certain places, the stuff that kind of exists and in the peripheries between sort of reality and myth and folklore and storytelling. And those are the kind of things that really intrigue me. And as with the Cairngorms book, I wanted this book to be a kind of personal exploration of those places, going to find elements of the landscape and features in the landscape that I'd heard about, either in passing or in kind of obscure texts and things like that, just to sort of find out for myself and put some sort of context on some of the stories that I'd heard. So anything that is in the kind of realm of half truth and mystery and folklore just added much more intrigue to me, and it, in that sense as well, I felt like it was kind of almost important to shine a light on some of these places because they're not recorded in a formal sense. So a lot of the narratives are lost or missing. And one of the first chapters is about the building of the Blackwater reservoir and the Blackwater Dam. So the workforce was drawn a lot from the navvies and the itinerant workers who at the time went around Scotland and Britain, and they had to work in very, very appalling, very hard conditions on building the hydroelectric scheme there, the dam. And part of visiting this place was to sort of tell their stories and tell something of the sort of unwritten narrative that goes into these places. So that was really important for me. But yeah, in terms of choosing what goes in, again, I try and sort of find something that's got a story to tell, that has a narrative, that has some sort of backstory that isn't very well known about, or actually has a legacy that still has some sort of contemporary relevance today as well.
I thought it might be really nice as well for those of you who've been remiss enough not to put your pre-orders in. If maybe you could kind of give a bit of a flavour of the book, maybe do a little reading, would that be okay?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. So I'm just going to read out a passage from the first chapter, which is I guess trying to describe some of the things that I've just tried to talk about and what I would try to, or how I try to perceive these unremembered places and these wild histories. I'm captivated by these kinds of places, although compelled is perhaps a better word to describe the slightly obsessive nature of my interest. For many years, I had regularly roamed Britain's largest and most inhospitable mountain range, the Cairngorms, searching for something akin to what the writer Roger Deakin had described as the unwritten places, fragments of human and natural history that had somehow become lost in that vast granite landscape of plateau and corrie. Like the Glenloyne Caves, these were peripheral places, existing at the edges of our collective memory and often hidden by dint of sheer geographical remoteness. I had come to think of them best described as wild histories. Wild, certainly, in that they were located in wilderness areas, but wild also in an almost anthropomorphic sense, feral, uncared for, mostly unknown or nameless, and outside the boundaries of public consciousness. It's hard to believe that in such a densely populated archipelago as ours, there are features of our landscape that could remain undocumented or unexplained, that there are places beyond our comprehension or recollection. Perhaps this is because we've become disconnected, distanced both physically and in thought from the familiarities of wild places. So much so that we have come to regard our history with a distinctly contemporary geographical bias, a predominantly categorized, class-bound and urban interpretation of the past. But this is forgetting that we have only relatively recently become a nation of city dwellers, and that Britain's northern latitudes are still a place of wildness, a literal edge domain full of mountain and moor, forest and fen. And it is from these places that we have ancestrally travelled. When thought of in this way, the landscape of Scotland becomes a vast diorama, the setting for countless narrative scenes, lives and stories overlaid, some more vivid than others. These wild histories define us, perhaps more than any iconic building or national monument, for they are the records of things inconsequential and commonplace. They are the simple transactions of life and land, of life in land, the same repetitive priorities that echo distantly in our own lives today.
Oh, that's really lovely. It's really lovely. I've actually underlined part of that passage in my copy of the book because I always scribble on books. I know it's a terrible thing to do.
Yeah, I do the same.
But obsession was the word that I underlined because you said at the start about how the journeys that you did took kind of across 4 years, but when you're talking about the sea fortress in the Forth of Firth, you're saying that's been somewhere that you've been thinking of for about 20 years, I think it was. How long has these places? It almost seems like they've haunted you. These places.
Yeah, a little bit, but it's kind of time and ability to get to places that there's so many. In fact, there's still so many things on the list that I'm probably never going to get to do them all. But yeah, certainly there are a few there that just have been almost niggling, that you just think, I've got to get there at some point. I've got to do this, and you tend to be diverted off to do something or the other. But yeah, it's somewhat of an obsession, a good obsession in a way, I suppose. But yeah, I suppose that sort of brings it to the sort of process of writing a book like this as well, in the sense that, and you'll know the same, Matt, I'm sure, is that the physical research is an inherent part of the book. It's, that movement in the landscape, of being in the landscape, of visiting these places and understanding and trying to interpret the emotion you have when you visit these places is so important, and making those journeys can be, it can be quite a lot of preparation and quite logistically sort of challenging to get to some places as well. So, it's.
I was going to say that actually, kind of some of the things that you did were, you couldn't just toddle on down when you want. And I think the honesty of your book was something that I really enjoyed. The fact that, there were a couple of times when you got turned back by wind or snow, by terrible conditions. And, you kind of really did appreciate the fact that, like you said, it was an effort to get to some of those places. Do you think that kind of, that honesty is something that you really value?
Yeah, I think so. But to me, you can't kind of separate out and sort of airbrush over these things anyway, because certainly in Scotland, if you're in certain remote environments in Scotland, you are going to come up against conditions that are pretty difficult. And if you spend time in the outdoors, it becomes a matter of fact. So to not acknowledge that would seem quite ridiculous in a way. So, but I think it's part of the narrative of the book, and a part of the narrative of these places anyway. Actually, in that they are wild and they are elemental, and the people that inhabited or moved through these landscapes before us would have been subject to these natural forces that we actually can choose to be exposed to or not, actually. And that's the real difference, is that we sort of, when you're writing a book like this, you can kind of hopefully try and pick a time that where the conditions are going to coincide, and it's going to allow you to be in some places. But it would be kind of remiss not to sort of talk about that. And actually that kind of, for me, that made the journeys as well, because they were uncertain a lot of the time, and you don't necessarily know what you're going to find or what the conditions are going to be like. And
see, that was another thing that really interested me, just because I suppose, going back to the obsession thing, these were places that you've thought about a lot, you've obviously researched a lot, and then I kind of wondered what it felt like to actually be there, to arrive in these places that you've thought about, especially some of the island locations. Kind of islands have this kind of, I don't know, I think when I'm kind of going to a wild place, you kind of have an expectation of what that experience must be like. And I'm just kind of wondering how that actually fitted together for you. were you surprised by any of them? Was there anything that you were really surprised by or excited about? Or
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely, and that's a very good question. That's I think you always have especially when you're researching beforehand, you have preconceptions about what you're going to find there, or you have anticipations of what you want to find. And it's almost like reading some people will never read a travel guide before they go on holiday because they don't want to be surprised. And it's almost getting that balance of, well, actually, I'm interested in it, and I've heard these stories about this place, and I want to learn a bit more. But actually, I don't want to know too much before I get there. Actually, because I want that first impression, that emotional connection with a place to be really strong, and to be able to record that. And I suppose one of the places where that really felt significant was when I went to the Slate Islands, which are just south of Oban on the west coast of Scotland.
They sounded so strange.
Strange and beautiful, but beautiful and strange because of their desolation and what's been left there. So they were part of the slate mining industry. They were the world's hub for slate production from about the 17th century onwards for at least 200 years. So it was a very, very busy, very thriving, teeming place, and is now certainly the main island that I wanted to get to, Birlinn, is completely deserted. It's uninhabited now. So for a while I'd known about this place. I'd wanted to get there, and when I did get there, it wasn't disappointing in the sense that yes, I knew a certain amount of what I was going to see there. I'd seen photographs, but the sort of visceral immediacy of some places really catches you. And there was just near the shore where we landed our kayaks, there was a row of old cottages that were once used by the slate miners and their families. And the tiny places, hardly any of the walls remaining. The roofs were gone, but they looked out onto this vista of, within a few hundred yards, just this small bay, and then beyond that there were the islands of the other islands of the South Inner Hebrides, the Garvalics, and it's beautiful and such a beautiful setting. But at the same time, you can kind of imagine the brutality of living there in the winter and having Atlantic storm surges, hitting these cottages. But at the same time, it just must have been other times really, really tranquil and beautiful. So, until you kind of reach somewhere like that, you just can't get that from a photograph. You almost have to stand there in person and just
No, I think you really summed up the kind of the haunting atmosphere of a lot of these places as well, because when you have the relics, it does strange things to the time. They're both of that time and of this time. It's almost like these kind of places are kind of anachronisms. They're just, I don't know, if something strange happens, and I think you really captured that atmosphere beautifully.
Yeah, and that's I suppose for me that's part of the emotional response of going to these places is that you see what's been there before, and it's the sense of something being left as well, and I sort of touch upon that in the book as well, of that feeling of items left in the landscape for whatever reason, whether it's accidental, whether it's because people had no other choice but to move on and leave their possessions and leave their homes, or whether it's deliberate, whether it's kind of mementos and shrines, so to speak, or monuments that have been left in wild places. They again have a kind of equally profound and important meaning as well when you come across them. So yeah, it's that type of thing that really, and it's still captures my imagination, is when I come across these places to sort of think about the connection of why they're there and who's left them or why they've been left.
You mentioned that you've got a list of unremembered places that are unwritten in the Baker Notepad. Is there any that that you still want to really kind of visit?
Yeah, so there's definitely there's a big list still, and probably top of that list was a journey that I was planning on making around about now, in Assynt, which is in the far north of Scotland, and it was to a mountain called Sullivan, which is a very, very beautiful mountain that kind of rises up, very isolated hill that rises up from the landscape. It's very prominent and probably one of the most beautiful mountains in Scotland, and I was planning on kind of making a trip there by canoe to close to the foot of the hill, and then just going up to find, or to the
not with your canoe though. You wouldn't climb with your
No,
canoe.
definitely not in the canoe. Good. I would be leaving that. That would be hard work. So to leave the canoe and then to set off on foot up the hill, in particular to have a look at a feature in the landscape, which is a wall. It's called the Destitution Wall, and it was built at the time when there was a huge amount of poverty in the area, and it was part of the poor relief scheme and system where completely pointless objects and features were built in the landscape. So across the top of
God!
Ridge, I guess it must be about 600-700 meters. You have this. It from what I've seen on the photos, it's actually a really beautiful looking wall in a completely incongruent and pointless place. And I've not been there yet, actually. So I really wanted to see that and make a kind of big trip about doing that, and do that by kind of paddle and by foot. But so that's number one on the list, definitely, when things go back to normal.
Oh, well, I look forward to reading about that because it sounds fascinating. But look, I think we're going to have to wrap it up now. So, but look, Patrick, thank you so much. And I just want to remind you, here's my copy, slightly grubby. I've been reading it in the garden, so I do apologise. But Patrick Baker, The Unremembered Places, Exploring Scotland's Wild Histories. It's published today, 21st of May, by Birlinn Books, and it really is something special.
That's great. Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate that.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.